introduced. We'll chat a bit more about what may change based on what we've seen happen so far from both a regulation standpoint and at that broader industry level. And with all these changes, we'll focus in on how companies can prepare, what they can do to feel confident, and what they should focus on as these changes continue to happen. And finally, we'll wrap up chatting more about the powerful role that technology can play in all of this to streamline processes and consolidate all of your efforts. But first, a quick introduction into the two faces you see on the screen here. My name is Isha Varma. I'm a product marketing manager here at Cority. I focus on our sustainability solutions, working on launching new and exciting features and functionalities to help our customers manage and accelerate their sustainability programs. And with me, I have Alex Hardwick.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name's Alex Hardwick. I'm Director of Sustainability Planning and Enablement here at Cority. So I really work across our customer base in terms of developing our products and our offerings, developing content that's used within our software and within our advisory offerings, and also in terms of navigating emerging landscapes globally. So not just with the US focus, but really across the globe. Happy to be here.
Awesome. Thanks, Alex. So to begin, let's have a quick look at the mandatory landscape in the US as it stands today. As it stands, we can put the landscape into 4 key categories: state level, national level, international level, and then the investment focus side. The first being state level mandates. So these are regulations put into place by various states and are mandated by those governments. So far, we've seen California take the first significant step here in addressing the growing concern of climate change by signing 2 important bills into law. The Climate Corporate Data Accountability Act, or SB 253, targets companies exceeding $1 billion in revenue and mandates the reportings of scopes 1 to 3 GHG emissions from those companies, while also requiring third-party verifications of those emissions. The Climate-Related Financial Risk Act, or SB 261, targets entities with annual revenues exceeding $500 million and mandates the submission of reports on climate-related financial risks and mitigation strategies to the California Air Resources Board. Now, following closely behind California is New York, where there are currently 2 proposed bills. These sort of mimic the California ones, where they require certain businesses to report on all scopes 1 to 3 emissions, as well as prepare an annual climate-related financial risk report, submitting that to the Secretary of State, and also making that report available to the public. So these bills in New York are still in the early stages of the legislation process, with expectations that companies will be impacted in the coming years. And other states following suit are Washington, Rhode Island, and Minnesota as examples. So the second part of the mandatory landscape is the national level. A few years back, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, or SEC, released a new climate-related disclosure rule for public companies to begin reporting their carbon emissions alongside their financial results. So the SEC voted on the proposed rules in March of last year, and key takeaways included that large public companies would now need to report on scope 1 and 2 emissions if they have a material impact on financial performance. So now the third major section is the international regulations, with the biggest, most game-changing regulation being the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, or the CSRD. It's the latest for the EU, impacting all companies either EU-based or with operations in the EU. The regulation also introduces the ESRS, or the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, which are a set of standards that outline the mandatory concepts and principles that companies must align their final reports to. Within the CSRD, companies will also need to include a double materiality analysis, as well as the upstream and downstream emissions information on their supply chains. And finally, the last section is the investment focus side. And a key regulation here includes the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, or SFDR. This is a part of an extensive ESG-based set of regulations implemented by the EU. And the principal aim is really to redirect capital flow towards sustainable finance, prevent greenwashing, and provide transparency within the financial markets to ensure that participants can embed sustainability into their decision-making. So that was a view of what the current landscape is and how it stands. Now, with all the shifts happening across the country and the world, what is going to change? And here are some of our predictions. First, as the priorities shift at the national level, we can see and predict that the role of mandating regulations and making strides in sustainability will fall into the hands of individual states. Like mentioned earlier, states like California and New York are some of the leaders in the moment here. Second, as the new administration comes into power, it's likely that we'll see the previously introduced regulations by the SEC not move any further. This means that it's likely that no federal mandates or disclosures will be implemented for US-based companies around sustainability. Third, on the international level, the rollout of the CSRD will ramp up over the next few years, expanding across very large companies to ones with smaller operations. This will also begin to implicate more organizations in North America with European operations or with significant business there. And even if an organization does not have operations or businesses in the EU, there will be indirect effects in terms of the data you're asked for by your customers, which Alex will touch on later in this presentation. In the international world too, meanwhile in Asia, there has been very significant growth in the number of standards being rolled out. And this growth has been driven by the work of the International Sustainability Standards Board, or ISSB, with the development of the IFRS S1 and S2 standards. So these standards have given entities clearer direction when developing their mandates, with major stock exchanges and sustainable finance groups actually in Singapore, Hong Kong, China, and India leading the rollout of these standards. And while this is being done to drive improvement, there also is a desire to avoid potential non-tariff barriers around sustainability disclosures and due diligence. But it is worth highlighting in the international world that a huge percentage of companies, according to the KPMG, so 82% out of the top 250 companies of the world, are including sustainability disclosures in their annual financial reports. So at a global scale, sustainability disclosures and mandates are not slowing down. And finally, trends within the investor focus and driven landscape are the hardest to predict. Based on the actions taken by some funds and other investment groups over the past few months, it's highly likely that in the United States, investors will scale back or perhaps even entirely abandon requirements around their sustainability disclosures. Others may choose to reframe what they do. Outside of the US, the behavior investment groups may be varied. Some may be driven by local trends in their home markets to continue their efforts or scale up as reporting requirements increase at a national level. Others may decide to align more with the actions of their US peers. And we may even see some divergence across subsidiaries as organizations attempt to satisfy different markets with different viewpoints. So this is our view of the predictions happening across the landscape. Now, what do we actually know so far based on what's happened in the past few months? First, the US has withdrawn from the Paris Agreement, which is an international treaty guiding nations to reduce GHG emissions and limiting the global temperature increase to below 2 degrees Celsius. This doesn't come as a huge surprise since this change happened previously with the administration back in 2017. Second, changes will happen to the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, which is a USA-based agency that aims to protect people and the environment from any risks. There is a new administrator leading the group that's been recently appointed, which will create shifts in the key priorities and strategies of the group. Third, federal cuts have been made to DEI mandates and policies, reducing the requirements previously introduced, i.e. measuring the S in ESG has decreased. We've seen the changes happen already where the administration has rolled back on previous efforts enacted around DEI inclusion laws. Fourth, and as mentioned before, the states are leading the charge here on enacting sustainability and ESG rules, initiatives, and investments. So now I'll toss it over to Alex to chat a little bit more about what companies can do to better prepare with all the changes upcoming.
Yeah, thanks. I think the first thing that I'd like to talk about here really is that international view of the way that reporting requirements are going to change. And so obviously we highlighted in the introduction the CSRD, or the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. I think one of the really important things to bear in mind here is that there's a lot of focus on the direct impacts of the CSRD, but I'd also like to talk about the indirect impacts. So, as you know, there are thresholds in place for people, for companies to comply with the CSRD. And based on those thresholds, around about 3,000 US companies are expected to be implicated. And those are the companies that have operations in the EU of a certain size or generate a very significant proportion of their revenue in the EU. And obviously for those companies, the effects will be quite profound. So, there's a double materiality analysis process, which requires companies to really kind of look into and systematically approach what they report against. The CSRD overall has about 1,200 different questions. You don't have to report to all of them, but you must go through a very meticulous process to determine which topics are material and how you want to report. Then there's a significant gap analysis process, because this will undoubtedly uncover areas that require new data to be found and then imported into any sustainability reporting landscape that you have. And that's because there's a large number of data points across a very diverse range of topics. And even beyond that, on the reporting side, it requires a level of comparability and systematic reporting in terms of this machine-readable IXBRL format that will be extremely significant. But of course, a lot of these requirements won't be emerging until 2028 for the directly affected businesses. Instead, I think what we can already start to see, and we're already seeing it within our customer base, is some of the indirect impacts in terms of what companies are being asked to provide from their customers in the EU. So if your customers in the EU are reporting now on fiscal year 2024, you may be asked for additional information that previously you hadn't been asked for. And obviously I'm focusing strongly here on the CSRD, but I think we can see similar levels of increase in the kinds of data being asked for other regions and countries that have ISSB, so IFRS S1 or S2 aligned standards that they're rolling out. Isha mentioned some of those in Singapore, in India, Australia, etc. So I think some of the examples here, more granular scope 1, 3, perhaps making scope 3 mandatory, as will also be the case with the California state regulations, and a lot more detail on impacts, risks, and opportunities. So impacts, risks, and opportunities is a very big thing within the ISSB and therefore within CSRD, and that's something that a lot of companies are being asked to provide far more detail on. What are your climate impacts, what are your non-climate impacts, and what are your mitigation strategies in the longer term. And then obviously adding on to that, just brand new categories of information which will be challenging for companies to collect. So we've seen a big uptick in the number of companies being asked to record biodiversity impacts. There's a whole section on biodiversity within the CSRD, and many companies have never considered it before, and a wider variety of social and governance metrics. So I think what's important here is that if you are looking beyond just what's going on, to the companies directly affected, you can see that there are some additional requirements that we'll start to see filter through the supply chain. Now, I will just talk about two uncertainties here, which have been introduced really in the last few weeks. So the first is the Omnibus simplification package, which is a rather wonderful name, but what that is a new initiative that's been tabled within the EU to try to reduce the administrative burden of the CSRD. And so that's about simplifying the existing sustainability reporting frameworks, eliminating overlaps in directives. So some of you may be aware that there's CSDDD, which we had a question about, and I'll talk about a little bit later on, CBAM and CSRD. Apologize for all of the acronyms there, but there's a load of these different requirements. They all overlap a bit. So can those be eliminated? So essentially, can these be streamlined and so on? That's being examined at the moment. One of the key things, though, is that there's it's very keen to kind of not compromise the EU's ambitions on sustainability goals. That is a stated aim of the Omnibus simplification package. So simplify perhaps the number of requirements, but without scaling back the level of ambition. And the second area that we don't know much about is what legal challenges could emerge outside of the EU as these things become mandatory. 2028 can seem a long way away given all the things that have happened in the last couple of months, but will there be legal challenges from non-EU countries to protect their interests? And of course, we can't know the answer to that. But again, with CSDDD, we're already seeing some discussion of that. So that's just one lot of predictions. Another area, if I'll just advance that. Okay, did that advance properly, Isha?
All good.
Yes. Yep. Okay.
Yeah.
And the other area then just to talk about is what we could see in terms of projects. So outside of the reporting landscape, what is going to happen in terms of renewable projects and so on? And that's going to be a very interesting element because, of course, the trend here has been, as you can see there, for the renewables to increase significantly. Coal has been reducing in the past few years, and this is something that we've seen really across different states, and it will be interesting to see, obviously, with some of the new policies that are being enacted to increase fossil fuel extraction, how those could potentially clash with some of the state level aims to reshore manufacturing, increase energy independence, and so on. And so it's not a certainty that some of those things are going to go away. There's still a lot of states are very keen to maintain the industries that they've built up in those areas, and obviously if those trends continue, then that's going to kind of be a little bit in contrast to some of the requirements around reporting at the federal level. So I think that's something to need to keep an eye on. It's still the case that 24 states and territories have enacted a goal to have 100% clean energy no later than 2050. But of course, we still don't quite know what will happen to those, and what legal challenges may emerge. I think the other thing as well is a little bit in a similar way to what we're talking about, increased reporting. There is likely to be an increased level of information gathering on the sustainability of new projects, certainly overseas. We'll see if that continues at home, but we still see kind of when financing new projects to be eligible for certain tax breaks or to be eligible for certain grants, a certain level of due diligence and environmental protection must be reached in a lot of countries, which again will affect any business that is investing in projects or supplying projects in countries or territories that have those sorts of mandates. So just moving on then to how companies can prepare, and obviously this is something which is challenging for companies at the moment to know exactly what they should and shouldn't be doing. I think the first thing is that investing in a data collection strategy and a process to manage requests, I would regard as something that is certainly not decreasing in importance. I think what will happen is that we're going to see increasing divergence globally, and that will be challenging for everybody because you're going to have the convergence that we'd hope to achieve with ISSB and IFRS may stay in certain regions, but in other places we're going to have divergence at state level, divergence at federal level. So I think that's something which is complicated, but therefore what we're going to see is lots of different organizations perhaps doing some of their own things. The number of sustainability queries is not going to necessarily go down, but they may just be a little bit less harmonized. However, streamlining the efforts to collect, analyze, and respond to those requests will stand you in good stead, will be efficient, and will then, protect you a little bit when things change in the future, as they almost certainly will. And a well-organized data strategy will then kind of just ease the pressure on a team that may not be expanding. Let's be honest. It may be that the team's not expanding, but the number of requests isn't necessarily going away. So having a process, having a strategy to collect all the data once and then report it out many times efficiently is kind of at the cornerstone of just really protecting yourself from that risk. The second thing here is, of course, the global view. So, global regulations are continuing, and it will be interesting to see, of course, if there's influence here in terms of what other regions do. Some might regard the Omnibus simplification package as something that has been influenced by changes in the United States. But what we can say is that, particularly in Asia, the growth in the number of reporting standards aligned with ISSB has been really significant, particularly any of those where it's publicly listed companies or investor-led initiatives. So I think that's something which is of note. Any US-based company that is operating internationally is going to continue to be impacted, and that's something that needs to be kind of communicated and managed as a risk. The third one here would really be around trying to, wherever possible, focus on the benefits, right? So cost savings, efficiency, and I mentioned obviously the cost saving might be related to projects, initiatives to become more energy efficient, for example. But even if we're thinking about the efficiency of the teams that you guys operate within and how you guys can respond to demands from customers, that's still an efficiency aim that you can communicate when asking for budget or protecting a budget. And then the fourth one is trying to make sure that you're aligned with a corporate vision and talking the right kind of language wherever possible. So we've started to see a lot of reframing around risk mitigation, right? So how can I talk about what I'm doing in terms of weather risk mitigation or whatever it might be, just making sure that things that are going to be important to the business long term are still going to be protected. They're still going to be considered. It's still the case that a lot of the companies with better ESG performance still show better top line growth. That still hasn't changed. But it may be that the way that these things are talked about, the way they're framed, and how they're aligned with corporate goals may have to change, just to ensure that there's still a long-term view of managing risks and transition plans. And bear in mind the world is still changing, right? We are reaching energy tipping points in different areas and so on. So those are still risks that need to be managed, even if the reporting landscape changes. Which brings me onto my final slide here, which is just, penultimate actually, which is just around the role of technology. So I think, something to think about here is how does technology fit into all of this? A reporting solution can really help you to streamline your efforts to collect, track, and report on sustainability performance and identify those areas of risk and opportunity. And that theme that I talked about before of gather all of your data and then have the capability to respond to those requests as they emerge. So gather once, filter, re-aggregate and send out is kind of the key thing. Our team is in the middle of a reporting season at the moment where we're getting a lot of supplier questionnaires. All those supplier questionnaires are coming to us with different requirements. Having a system that allows us to divide up that data and get the people that we are suppliers of the right information is invaluable. Leverage answers and data from across frameworks, align with those international frameworks, which will likely be guiding your customers, and then setting and measuring progress, so showing beyond the reporting side of things what is being achieved through what you do. And finally, I think there's a part here that we haven't spoken about too much, but when we're thinking about some of these emerging requirements, there's a lot of scrutiny on auditing and assurance processes. So a lot of these mandates are requiring people to move from limited to reasonable assurance. So limited assurance meaning you're kind of spot checking some of the calculations, and then moving to reasonable assurance, where you might be checking 80% plus of these calculations or any other information that is being gathered. And obviously that creates a very different landscape in terms of traceability, right? So taking a load of spreadsheets and trying to just put them all into a single SharePoint folder becomes much more difficult if you have that sort of accounting standard mentality in terms of auditing, and that's what a lot of companies are moving to. We've seen it already, again, with the CSRD here in Europe, but then that's spreading globally as we align with, ISA 3000, ISSA 5000. So having a single place where you can really track those the data points right back to their source is something that's really, really important. So that was everything that I wanted to cover there, Isha. I think we had a couple of questions that we'd received in the run-up to this, which we're going to cover off. Do we want to tackle those?
Yeah, let's do some. Let's do it. So, Alex, you mentioned CSRD, and we talked at length about CSRD, but what are your views on CSDDD and how it'll impact U.S. companies?
Yeah, so CSDDD, for those of you who haven't, and this is where I need to explain, there's three kind of different regulations here, right? So CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, then there's the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which is similar to the CSRD, but it has a much stronger supply chain focus. So it requires companies to conduct due diligence on their own operations, subsidiaries, business partners, supply chain, and then document and plan to remedy, it's an important point, any negative impacts related to human rights and the environment, and it requires you to create a transition plan. So that's what it is, right? In terms of who it will affect, the thresholds are fairly similar to what we see with CSRD, in that it's a lot of companies with significant operations or who generate a significant amount of their revenue in the EU. There is a lot of scrutiny on it in the United States at the moment, and I saw that it was recently described as a serious concern for American industry and the American economy. So I think this is one where we definitely could expect that there might be some legal challenges, but that's kind of to be determined. So the first thing is, would you be in scope for it? Then there's a second thing of, how will it be viewed? A lot of people are talking about this, obviously, in terms of it being a non-tariff barrier. Now, look, lots of non-tariff barriers exist in terms of the way that products are standardized and so on. So whether that alone is enough to kind of get rid of it for US companies, I'm not so sure. But I think that's something which will be interesting. It'll also be interesting to see what emerges from the Omnibus simplification package in terms of rollout, and whether, as I said, I think that's one where, more so than CSRD, because there's a sort of extraterritorial element to that one in terms of you must remedy your supply chains all the way up, that is being seen as something that could be a challenge. The SEC is looking at it now. So I think keep an eye on it, but I think that one will be interesting. What I would say is, again, returning to the same theme as the CSRD, even if it were to be challenged, for the US companies reporting to it, the indirect effects are unlikely to go away. So again, if you are a supplier to an EU company who has to comply with the CSDDD, you may still feel an effect, even if you yourself are not going to be reporting to directly ever, or at least not before sort of 2027 or 2028. But that one I think is potentially more uncertain, but it's interesting to keep an eye on. It's certainly something that companies should be aware of and think about it, certainly when they're thinking of what data they might need to gather. Good question.
Awesome.
And I think we had another one. Okay, I'll ask you this one then. So cool. This is from David saying, looking to invest in sustainability technology, what are the points we should double down on to get internal buy-in? So, okay, just in the context of everything that's going on, how do you get buy-in, secure budget, all of those fun things?
Yeah, totally. I think we mentioned this, Alex mentioned this in one of our previous slides, but the first is really showing how sustainability technology supports and aligns with company strategies, business goals, and corporate values. There is this extremely strong potential for sustainability efforts to drive revenue, improve efficiency, and meet key business goals. It's more than just a trend here. So ensuring that stakeholders understand this will be extremely important in building that case. The second is around meeting regulations and maintaining compliance, which is a big theme of our discussion today. This is a non-negotiable, as we've discussed, and without technology, it will be likely extremely tricky to meet the requirements around regulations like the CSRD. So companies can look to build a case around reducing risks and avoiding any fines or penalties from non-compliance. And finally, showcasing cost efficiencies and savings. Stakeholders love hearing about cost-saving opportunities, and technologies can really help us find ways to make processes more efficient and more from an administrative and a management standpoint. So that would be great to highlight as well. Awesome. Okay,
Can I also just add
actually,
to that as well, because it actually
Yes.
speaks to something that that we had in the chat, which is the other one I think, which is worth mentioning, is data security and the view on that. And we had a kind of question around it, which we'll answer separately. But just another point here is having your data all over the place in unsecure systems is a risk.
Yeah.
So another one of those risks to manage is data security. Going with something which is SOC 2 certified is another huge value.
Absolutely. Okay, awesome. I do think that's all the time we have today. So thank you all for joining. I do see there's some other questions in the chat, but we'll definitely respond after this via email. And if you do have any other questions, our contact information is available in the console on your screen. So please feel free to reach out. You'll receive the webinar recording shortly after this in case you wanted to rewatch or access any of the information on the slides. But we really appreciate your time today, and we hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.